Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
I'm David Kellogg, publisher of Foreign Affairs, and welcome to this session of Foreign Affairs Live. I would like to express our appreciation for our sponsor, the International Bank of Azerbaijan. The reception that will follow, to which you are all invited, is thanks to, made possible by their generosity. As readers of Foreign Affairs, you are part of a very special community, and we are really glad to see so many of you here tonight. I hope you have been spending lots of time on the new foreignaffairs.com, which launched recently. It's publishing a steady stream of original content, and there are some really interesting user comments and discussions that you should participate in. I hope you'll also visit the Foreign Affairs Job Board, which attracts a stellar pool of candidates for positions and fellowships and grants. Now for a few housekeeping announcements. Out of courtesy to our speakers, we request that you not leave the meeting early. Please turn off all electronic devices. And if you ask a question during the question and answer session, please stand, wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and limit yourself to one concise question at a time. And now it's my honor to introduce our esteemed editor, Jim Hoge.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome everybody. This ought to be a very interesting subject because it's quite topical. It's all about the economy, ours and everybody else's, and what kind of direction is it headed in, and what's good and perhaps bad about that. The focus for our discussion tonight, to start with, is a piece in the current issue of Foreign Affairs by Ian Bremmer, and it's called State Capitalism Comes of Age, the End of the Free Market, and there's a question mark at the end of that, so we'll see if we can get rid of the question mark before the evening's over. Now, Ian is president of Eurasia Group. That's a political risk research and consultancy firm. He's the author of a best-selling book, J-Curve, A New Way to Understand Why Nations Rise and Fall. And he has a new book out now that he co-authored that's called The Fat Tail. He's great with titles, don't you think? Fat Tail, The Power of Political Knowledge for Strategic Investing. Felix Rohatyn, who's with us tonight, is an eminent investment banker known to all New Yorkers. He's a former ambassador to France and a former chairman of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, where he managed the negotiations that enabled New York City to resolve its financial crisis. Felix also has a book out. It's called Bold Endeavors, How Government Built America and Why It Must Rebuild It Now. There are fuller resumes in your programs, but I think that'll do it to tell you who we are very briefly up here. Ian, let me start with this. Your book, among other things, says that state capitalism is not only on the rise, but actually has risen. And the question is how permanent this may be. But before we get to that, and to maybe the pluses and minuses of it, let's just get a definition out there. One I came across was that state capitalism is the assumption of a large role in directing and managing economic institutions and activities. Now, that takes us so far, but there are basic building blocks to state capitalism. You identify really 4 big ones in your book. What are they, and why are they the keys?
Well, I think it's a primary role, as opposed to just an important role. I mean, states have important roles in the economy just about everywhere around the world. But when I think about what state capitalism is, maybe for one quick second I should say what state capitalism isn't, which is that for the last 20, 30 years, as we've talked about banks that should be self-regulating and a lack of, sort of government oversight, hyper-leverage and all the rest, increasingly it's been the age of the rise of the multinational corporation. And you saw Naomi Klein and a lot of other people saying, the state's out the window, the state's dead. End of history, we had the end of the state. And increasingly multinational corporations seeking to maximize profitability in global markets, taking advantage of global economies of scale and global differentiations in labor rates, were becoming increasingly powerful. And so when I think about the rise of state capitalism, I think it's been happening for a long time under the radar as globalization has been this tremendous driver. And I think there have been a few basic building blocks, 4 basic building blocks. The first, and the one that we saw earliest in this phase of economic development, was the National Oil Corporation. Multinational energy firms, ExxonMobil, they do a lot of exploration and production, but really today they're a refining company. They're not primarily an E&P company. And they're the best refining company in the world. They do it really well. But as we saw with the formation of OPEC and with the oil shock, national oil corporations were increasingly dominant. Second building block, and the second chronologically, was the rise alongside emerging markets of state-owned enterprises and privately owned national champions who were connected to, linked to the state, even though they may not have been directly owned by the state. And we saw that over the past really 20 years with the rise of the BRICS, the N11, and others. Then the fourth building block, sovereign wealth funds, which have been around for decades, but there was no term sovereign wealth fund until really 5 years ago, becoming increasingly important and powerful in determining allocation of capital flows and investments. So I think if you bring those 4 building blocks together, you actually have the basis of state capitalism in today's system. And I still think that globalization was an overwhelming force compared to that growth until September, at which point the global economy was starting to hit the skids. We saw what happened after Lehman, and then you had the reaction of governments around the world saying, we have to fix this. We have to step in with regulation. We have to step in with stimulus. And it was the American and Western laissez-faire model that was pointed to as the problem. And who's coming out first of the recession right now? It's China. And I think that has major implications for the way we think about geoeconomics and geopolitics going forward.
Let's come back to China in a minute and see if this is a model that would work for others, or is it specific to China. But first I want to ask Felix, maybe to ruminate a bit, because you've had experience with state-owned this and that. What are the pluses, if any, of state-owned capitalism, and what are the biggest minuses?
Well, I think that I don't see anything terribly wrong with state capitalism, provided it's maintained in some reasonable relationship with the rest of the economy, etc. In some cases, it gets you decisions, it gets things done. So, I mean, to me, that started with Louis XIV when he asked his finance minister to get him some monopolies so that he could have some money. And that today is Saint-Gobain, which is the biggest glass company in Europe, but that came from Mr. Louis XIV. Then the Germans with Krupp, the British with the East India Company. I mean, this is a, I wouldn't say it's a habit, but it certainly was a widespread, still is a widespread way to run parts of the world. I mean, to me, the issue in state capital is not whether it's fascism, really, because it isn't, but whether it's efficient or relatively efficient, because no private or public entity that uses up a lot of money is usually efficient. And I would think, by and large, countries that allowed the growth of state capitalism have done reasonably well. Some have done extremely well, which mostly depended on the people that they put in there to run these things. So I think what you've done here is put a subject on the table that is very, very interesting, and can be used in many ways, because it's a very flexible development.
But it sounds to me, Felix, that the key to what you're talking about, state capitalism that's reasonably efficient, fast, and so on, depends almost too much on the people who are running the show. And there are no checks and balances, really, or at least they're more modest than in the free market. What happens when political influence begins to take over from economic decisions, when corruption starts rearing its head? Isn't this where the worry comes? And doesn't that happen after a period of time of state capitalism almost invariably.
Well, I think it happens under practically any system after a certain period of time, which is the bad side of the things that we look at every day. But corruption, mismanagement in a democracy brings corruption as quickly as anything else. So, as I said, I'm not. It doesn't frighten me. I understand that it depends on the people you put in there, but so does General Motors. And the moral of the issue, and how does it hit a democracy? What happens to huge differences in wealth and income, such as we're dealing with today? It seems to me that is probably the more sensitive area with respect to state democracy or state capitalism or any type of capitalism, as a matter of fact.
Ian, Obama's made a few comments that have gotten a lot of chatter about how maybe the continental system, particularly France, is not all that bad. Maybe we ought to be taking a look at it for some of the things that we need to do here, like comprehensive health insurance, broader safety net, and so on. Your own opinion, is that the road to go, the European model for the United States? And also, I'd be interested in, do you think state capitalism is a short-term phenomena that we're going to go through here, or is this one that's going to be with us for quite some time?
Well, I don't think that there is a European model. I think there are lots of European models. I know you agree with that too. Yeah. But do I think that it is useful to look at policies that have a little bit more state intervention and regulation and more of a social safety net in this country? Probably. I think we probably moved too far in the other direction. Do I suspect we will overshoot? Yes. Do I suspect we will end up with a little too much Europe? Sure. Do I think that Obama is much more ideological in the protection of consumers and not producers in what we've seen so far compared to the relative lack of ideology and pragmatism we're seeing on the foreign policy side? Yes, I do. And I'm more worried about that. But in part I'm worried because he has such an ambitious agenda that he can't do a lot of it, especially when a lot of people still haven't been confirmed. And so Congress ends up taking the lead on legislation. And from this regard, I mean, Specter actually doing the courageous thing, as they said, in becoming a Democrat. I thought it would be more courageous if he became a Republican, though it would be stupid in this environment, is going to be a problem for Obama. A stronger Congress is going to be, a stronger Democratic Congress is going to be more problematic on this front than one that's a little bit more balanced. So I'm not, be careful what you wish for if you're a Democrat in the administration right now.
Yeah, once you have a big tent, you've got a lot more views than you do when you have an hour tent party, as the Republicans are proving, and as the Democrats are in different ways.
Absolutely. But so do I think that state capitalism is a long-term phenomenon? Yes. But let me also say, a very interesting responding to Felix, I'm not someone who is suggesting that state capitalism is a bad thing, because I am not someone who would suggest that globalization was a good thing. Globalization was a very good thing if you happened to have been an entrepreneur in Bangalore. It was a bad thing if you were an auto worker in Detroit or the British Midlands. And I'm not going to stand in front of you or sit in front of you and try to suggest that the intrinsic morality or values of one of those people is better or worse than the other. It simply was a system that ascribed an understanding of who the winners and losers were. State capitalism is a scary thing because it implies change in who the winners and losers are. And we need to understand that. And I particularly think it's scary because the Americans are now in a position, as many Western corporations are, that we need access to Chinese labor, we need access to Chinese capital, we need access to Chinese markets, and yet a state capitalist system in a resurgent China is going to prove problematic, in my view, on all three of those fronts, in a way that we did not have to deal with in the Cold War, for example, because we didn't need access to the Soviet markets. We had different problems back then. I do not believe that state capitalism is a permanent state of affairs. I certainly don't believe America is moving towards state capitalism, even if they move towards Europe more as a system. But I do think that the G20 will increasingly reflect conflict of basic values and how important the state should be in the world, in the economy, both domestically and globally. And I think that's going to be a fight. And thus far, the initial reaction I see from the U.S. on the foreign policy side concerns me that they do not appreciate the scale of that fight.
You know, state capitalism occurs under a number of different political systems, some of which are quite liberal, some of them are mixed, and some, particularly China, is very authoritarian. In fact, China is the biggest authoritarian country really to go down this road. And I think some of the concern and that I hear over here about state capitalism, number one is it going to be efficient over the long run? But the other one is the capacity for an authoritarian government to use it politically if they so choose. Now, you point out in your book, for example, that of the 10 largest sovereign wealth funds, 9 are authoritarian. There's only one that's from democracy. Does that concern you?
I think it's something that we need to be very aware of. It concerns me in part because of the reaction. I mean, if I think about sovereign wealth funds, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when they're really flush, when they have lots of cash, let's face it, they're looking to make money. They're looking to maximize returns. The people that were actually managing those portfolios were the same people that were managing portfolios for Western institutions. They got picked off and paid a lot by Mubadala and Adi and all the rest, and they tried to make a lot of money. Now, in the course of the last 7 months, they have lost a lot of money. And as a consequence of that, they've either been fired or marginalized. Increasingly, the decisions being made in those sovereign wealth funds are being made by the political leaderships of those funds. And they are less focused on maximizing profitability in a resource-constrained environment than they are in ensuring their own stability and sustainability. So if you are in Abu Dhabi right now, your first priority is shoring up Dubai. Your second priority is ensuring that Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah are not so annoyed by that. And then you're looking at kind of the region. Well, that, first of all, is not the route to maximizing efficiency and productivity long term. Second of all, I would argue that's kind of if that happens all over the world with these sovereign wealth funds, that's long-term problematic for the United States, especially when there is a propensity among American citizens not to support foreign investments from these countries, not to move in a more pro-free trade direction. You look at the Pew polls that we've seen taken in America, Americans generally, overall, don't support free trade today. Chinese do, Turks do, Mexicans do, Indians do, but Americans don't. And so if I look at those trends together, I see a lot of countries that think that they were too coupled to the United States, and as a consequence, the financial crisis led to their own economic slowdown. They'd like to couple less. That may not be realistic, and long term it may be problematic for them, but we have to get through this dip to get to the long term.
Felix, let me touch on a more positive look at state capitalism, if you will, or public activity. Your book takes 10 examples from different periods of American history in which a very active, determined public effort made all the difference in terms of building fundamental infrastructure and institutions off of which we've been living ever since. And the book sort of suggests that there's been a period of time where that has not been the case, where there's been a paucity of that kind of activity. And you are calling, in the midst of the economic crisis we have now, for a very bold rededication, really, to infrastructure development, which you say can't happen without a big public leadership role in it. What are some of the things, how bad off are we in terms of infrastructure? And I'm using the term broadly, not just highways, bridges, and railroads, but schools and the rest of it.
There is an outfit called the Civil Engineers Society, I think.
Right.
And they do kind of a balance sheet every couple of years about the state of our infrastructure. And I think the last number that I've seen is that they felt that if we invested for 5 years in a total adding up to about $1.6 trillion or $1 trillion,
yeah.
that we might be getting to a point where it was livable. So, and at the same time, and I come back to the issue of employment,
Right.
which is, to me, the critical issue. It's not hard to do. I mean, the notion that we don't have the money to do $1.6 trillion, say, over the next 5 years, when we can do $3 trillion in 24 hours because Bear Stearns is going down the tubes, seems to me that doesn't quite jibe. So I think we need to do it. We can do it by making the adjustments to our fiscal position, to how we finance this. Do we finance it with a gasoline tax, or do we finance it just by selling bonds to somebody? And it seems to me it is a no downside thing, either for the unions or for the business people. So, on the other hand, I've said that for 15 years. It hasn't happened, and I haven't quite given up yet, but I'm close.
Well, now, for many decades, economists and very savvy folks like yourself have said one of the big problems in the American public sector is that we don't have a capital budget, and the Congress never wants to go along with a capital budget. You can tell us why, but there is a bill now in the Congress.
That's right.
That would create one. And why is that so important to what you're suggesting we need to do?
It shouldn't be, because you should be, I mean, you're dealing with the same amount of dollars, you call them something else possibly. Yeah. But the Congress has a ready-made excuse if they don't want to invest massively in infrastructure, in saying, look what it does to our budget, without telling people that the budget for infrastructure should be quite different from the income and expense budget of every day for weapons or whatever. But now there is, as I saw, there is, I think, a serious movement, to do infrastructure, and I think they've begun to understand that you can't do it without having, especially and get popular support for it, without explaining to people where this money is coming from and how we're financing it. And that, I think, requires a capital budget, and so far, the opposition has been because too many people in the Congress make a very good living off the crumbs of infrastructure and infrastructure construction. Once you have that capital budget as there, I think you can get things done. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think it's better. There's one thing I wanted to mention. There was a book written in 1958 or 9 by Adolf Berle. Yeah. It was called Power Without Property. Mm-hmm. And Power Without Property were the pension fund managers, the Dreyfus Fund. It was people who had power to manage money, other people's money, and invested, but it wasn't their own money. And that was a huge step. That's why the 60s were a big revolutionary part of life in the 20th century in the United States, which ended up in some problematic things, but it was the bridge from public investment to, well, not necessarily state investment, but a much broader.
Yeah.
That was a big movement.
Do you know, is the Obama administration supportive, mildly or strongly, of a bill to create a capital budget?
I don't know that. I know that they were supportive of infrastructure.
Oh yeah, they've talked a lot about infrastructure.
They were supportive of a bank for infrastructure, which is an absolute necessity. And I would think that they would probably go to this issue of capital budget fairly carefully. Because it touches so many interests. But I would think they have a terrific budget director down there now, and I think Obama is interested in change that's constructive. So, but for instance, we saved New York City by stretching our non-balance budget to 4 years without asking anybody, without just asking the state legislature, just signed it. But if we had to go for a 1-year budget balance, as most people are budgeted to do in the cities, which are in terrible trouble,
yeah,
we would never be able to do that.
And we do need to recognize here, just internationalizing this for a second, one of the things that China's been able to do so effectively has been marshal the cash very quickly and spend it, which is why over the last 5 days, bankers and economists have been stepping all over themselves to trying to, revise upwards their growth numbers for China.
Yeah, they have a big stimulus program, and it started almost the day after they announced it.
That's right. And you know what's also interesting, you go back to the last time China's had a real crisis, the Tiananmen Square episode, 1989, you look around China, and there was lots of public dissent among leaders in what to do on globalization, what to do internationally, what to do in terms of the dealing with the demonstrators. 6, 7 months ago, people talked about the Shanghai faction in China and these go-go industrialists, and they had one idea of what to do for growth, and the folks that had cut their teeth in the interior of the country had another. I don't see any of that now. I see very strong consensus on the part of Chinese officials across the board on what they need to do. They need to build the social safety net. They need to stimulate consumer spending. They need to get up the food chain in terms of improved technology on the export side, and they need to build internal infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying that's going to last for long, because as they start feeling confident again, and it's not much of a crisis mode, then you'll start to see these other interests really play out. But a country with 1.3 billion people, with a government that's that large, marshalling, 7% of the global GDP, something like that, right? That's fairly impressive. America couldn't do that. And I'm not suggesting that our system is inferior, believe me. I'm just suggesting that there are certain things we're not good at. And operating in crisis times when we feel relatively complacent is one of our problems.
We're going to turn to the audience, so if you have some questions, just put your hand up, tell us who you are, wait for a microphone, and we'll go from there. But one last question before we get there for both of you, and it has to do with the crisis that we're in right now. Care to speculate a bit on whether some of the green shoots we are seeing are sort of a mirage, or are they real signs that we may have bottomed out and are going someplace? And the second part of that question is, what's your best guess? Are we going to sort of shore up the old model that we had before? Or are we going to be, as we come out of this, are we going to be changing the nature of our economy in any substantial ways, in terms of regulation, in terms of the amount of socializing of things like healthcare and so on?
Well, I would think to begin with that if we have learned anything, it's going back to the days before Glass-Steagall was repealed, and repealing Glass-Steagall so that we can separate the investment side from the trading side of these big institutions, which were leading us right over the cliff. I don't know whether that'll happen or not, but I think that the difference between investment and expenditures has to be taught to the American people today. I think the role of the government is going to stay very, very strong, and for a long period of time. I mean, I think that would be a good beginning.
Looks like we're going to get health care this year, so that would be one huge step in socializing some risks. Pensions may be right behind it. What's your own feeling, Ian, about where we're headed?
Well, I mean, I think that there is going to be a big structural change, and the biggest one is going to be in the American consumer. 2005, what did we spend? 2.5% more than we actually had.
Right.
We're now at a 4% savings clip. That's going to continue to go up. I think that's structural. I don't think these levels of leverage are coming back anytime soon. I'm not an economist, but I talk to our clients, and that's certainly what they're telling me. And I think that a government has to reflect to a certain extent the structural constraints that it's actually operating in, and government's going to operate to fill some of that space. So I think that's structural. It's not structural in moving towards the kind of things that we've been talking about at the opening of this. What do I think about the green shoots? I mean, again, I wouldn't try to call bottom on the market, ask if we're going to hit again, but I would say two things. First is that talking to CEOs of major multinational corporations in the West, in the U.S., in Europe, even in Japan, where I was 3 weeks ago, they are now starting to talk about investing again. They're starting, as opposed to talking about bringing down their numbers and cost cutting and getting rid of people, as they're talking, the C-suites are looking at 1 year out, 2 year out, and they're saying, wow, there's some opportunities out there, some things are cheap, that's interesting. That's the good side. The bad side is that we're going to continue to see more hits in the real economy. We're going to continue to see more unemployment all over the world. And that's going to lead to social discontent. It's going to lead to more radicalization. I'm not worried about bread riots in the United States, but there are some countries around the world that will have vulnerabilities to that populism, and they will face serious problems. The thin tail risks that we would have thought about 7, 8, 9 months ago have become fatter tail risks in a number of countries that are important for us around the world. Russia's one. Turkey's one, Ukraine is one, Thailand's one, Egypt's one, Argentina's one, maybe even Mexico's one. Lord knows Pakistan is one. And as we think, and these are lagging indicators. They're not leading indicators. So as we think about the next 6, 12, 18 months, even if the American economy starts to look like it is slowing down the descent and picking up again, I am very worried about the vulnerabilities of some of those states, and I think we'll be paying a lot of attention to
Well, some of the forecasts that we see say that when we do come out of it, we're going to be ahead of everybody else coming out of it, and that Europe will still be in the doldrums, and parts of Asia as well. So the scenario could well be that we're looking better and feeling a bit more stable, but others are just the opposite.
Yeah, I think there'll definitely be, again, China's coming first,
Yeah.
but I think that the U.S. is certainly going to look a lot better in 12 months' time than a lot of the countries I just mentioned.
And I think Europe will do better than we give them credit for.
You think so?
Yes. I think when you look at what happened during all of these debates about the stimulus and where we were blaming the Europeans for not being generous enough, well, the Europeans have a much bigger safety net already in their structure than we do, so they were living off the same thing. And I think that they will be okay. I think we have. I'm glad to see that Sarkozy rejoin NATO, although it was just a purely. But I think to have a really well-financed army for NATO is a very, very important thing. And where we're going to find the money to do that, I don't know. But I think it's very necessary. We can't deal with the kind of problems we're going to see with the present force level, I think.
Right. And that's a topic for another night. What do we do with NATO? What's the mission supposed to be? Because I don't think at the moment we have a clear enough idea to make it a lasting institution of any effect. All right, here we go. Way in the back is a question. Next.
Good evening. We have heard a lot of explanations for the current economic crisis. Money supply increasing, interest rates being low, the credit default swaps, and the deregulation or lack of appropriate regulation. But nobody talks about the fact that 36% of the income is earned by 5% of the households. Another 34% of the income in this economy is earned by the next 15% of the household, which basically means 70% of the income goes to the top 20% of the population, and the rest have only 30%. We produce for masses, but the income is not distributed to give that purchasing power back to the masses. So they have to borrow and they have to use their credit cards. Do you think there is any public policy tool which could address that issue structurally, regardless of what kind of system we have or what we call it, whether it is a state capitalism or pure capitalism or socialism? The labels don't matter. Do we have a policy tool to address that?
The equality issues, what do you want to know? Go ahead.
Sure.
Why don't you start, Felix?
Well, I think that you've put your finger on probably one of the biggest cancers in this country, which is the mismatch between what the people who earn and the people who have capital. And that isn't going to go away. Now, maybe Mr. President Obama is going to try to do something with the tax system, but that can only take a very long time. Yeah. And be very, very difficult. And unless you have massive programs for education, public education, investment, etc., I don't see where you come out on this. But I think this is one of the big explosive issues here in this country and in probably the rest of the world.
Certainly in China it's growing as an issue.
It is, and in some countries it's not. And one of the reasons Brazil's been so effective is precisely because the Gini coefficient's been coming down. A real middle class has been growing. And that has helped to allow Lula over 80% approval ratings in a democratic country. And it's created the beginnings of a Washington consensus again in Latin America. So there are positive spins on this story in other parts of the world. But do I think that we're going to see a change in the United States? Frankly, I back what Felix was saying, which is that you need to see major infrastructure spending, education and the smart grid and all of the things that, because everyone that talks about just providing all sorts of sort of short-term subsidies and mortgage support and all the rest for the people that are presently underwater, you go back to the old saw, teach someone how to fish. And we've underinvested in infrastructure in this country for decades, and the only way you're actually going to bring everyone up is if you start putting that together again. But the size that we're talking about, Ambassador Rohatyn said 15 years he's been banging on this. I think he'll bang on for a little bit longer, sadly.
That's against the statistics today.
Thank you. I spent a lot of the 90s privatizing.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, I'm John Weber. And I spent a lot of the 90s privatizing businesses that were state-owned enterprises, telecommunications companies, utilities, steel industries, oil companies, and they were almost uniformly, patronage magnets and corrupt and angered. This is in the emerging markets in Eastern Europe and Latin America, angering their consumers and draining capital from the countries that owned them. And I'm just kind of wondering whether there's a kind of a state-owned enterprise 2.0 or whether we're sort of kind of easing back into the same mode. And those businesses were uniformly, very few exceptions, pretty unsuccessful at serving their stated purposes.
Yeah. I mean, look at Singapore, right? I mean, here you've got state-owned enterprises. Singapore is one of the most cohesive state organizations in managing an economy anywhere in the world. And yet they're reasonably transparent. Standards of corporate governance is pretty high. It's actually a pretty diversified economy. The manufacturing is still about a third of their GDP at this point, which is astonishing if you think of this tiny little technologically developed island, right? But what that tells me, in part is, I mean, they're not democratic, but they are quite open. They're quite small, and they're very wealthy. So it's state capitalism 2.0, but in part because Singapore is not really a country, right? It's a city-state. Do I see really effective mechanisms for state capitalism in large countries? I mean, you could look at something like Vale in Brazil, which is not really state capitalist anymore, but the state has a golden share and there's still a lot of influence. It's becoming more transparent, but Brazil itself has moved away from that model. So if you're asking me, do I see good governance in state capitalist organizations that are part of large authoritarian states with absence of independent judiciary and rule of law? Not really.
No, take China, which is the sort of the good housekeeping seal, big one on the block, so to speak. They apparently have very effective and efficient engineers running the government, and the central government is not that interested in corruption. Some central governments are, but they can't control it. Without transparency, without rule of law, all sorts of things can go on at the lower level, and the best you can do is every once in a while string somebody up as an example. And at least what I hear, Ian, I'd be interested in what you will. Corruption in China is getting bigger all the time and getting to be a major social issue with the Chinese people.
I think it is, but I also think it's still a local issue. All the demonstrations we hear about in China are largely focused on local officials, and the Chinese central government either deals with it and you never hear from them again, or makes an example of one or two people and then you never hear from them again. But either way, it's not yet structural. I mean, all these people that said China was going to fall apart if they went under 8% growth, who did that math? Right, in the FT and the Wall Street Journal. China's been growing at 10% on average for 30 years, and they've been growing because of the Chinese government, as opposed to India, where they grow in spite of the Indian government, with entrepreneurs finding ways to get around corrupt local bureaucrats. One of the things that concerns me is that the Chinese are generally angry about this downturn, but they do not blame corruption in China. They blame largely the West. And when the Chinese government comes out and says we want a new reserve currency to challenge the US dollar, even though it's completely unrealistic in the near term, in part they're playing into that. So my fear is that just because America and the American self-regulation system of the last 20 years proved to be inefficient and massively risky and hyper-leveraged and unequal does not mean that a Chinese system of huge entrenched corruption, no independent judges, and lack of rule of law is somehow a winner system. And yet, that is the lesson that is going to be taken by China. Now, long-term, China may well be unsustainable as a model, but long-term is really long-term. I mean, just because they will destroy themselves from an environmental perspective, and the people will be mad because it will be the Chinese government's fault. But that could take 20 years. People talk about the demography issue in China. Their demographics still keep looking better until at least 2015, before you begin to get a real tipping point.
But when it tips, it goes off a cliff.
But I'm not prepared to wait 6 years. I'm just saying that there aren't many corporates out there that are telling me, what do you think about China in 10 years? They want to know what I think in the next 1, 2, 3, 5. And 1, 2, 3, 5, I think they're pretty robust.
Felix, let me ask you about this reserve currency business, because the Chinese kind of surprised a number of us at the G20 by raising it. And everybody said what Ian has, which is, oh, well, that's a phantasma, at least until further in the future. The Chinese have not, since the G20 meeting, given up promoting this idea. They've had some currency swaps in Southeast Asia. They're announcing that Shanghai is going to be a financial capital to rival London and New York. And we just had a high Chinese official here the other day. And what they want to talk about is the need for a different reserve currency than the dollar. How seriously do you take it?
Oh, very. First of all, because it's perfectly logical. I mean, if I were the Chinese with the structure that I have, and an unease about this currency that's been piling up in my banks, I would certainly do that. They will not get a reserve currency, but they will get something. I don't know what it is. They may get permission to buy up 80% of the stock exchange companies. I mean, something is going to happen,
right,
in terms of the distribution.
So it could be bargaining that they're really up.
Oh, I think it is bargaining. I think, but it's dead serious bargaining.
Yes.
I mean, these guys are not fooling around.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Here comes the mic, and tell us who you are, and then ask your question.
My name is Bruce Dorskin. My question is the following. If we're going to have state capitalism, and the key is people, in the United States, relative to many other countries in the world, France, Germany, Singapore, and China, those people are well paid. In the United States, you have two kinds of people running state organizations: rich people who want to do good, or lifelong politicians. But how are you going to attract outstanding people when the salary of a cabinet level position isn't even as much as a division general manager at General Electric?
Well, destroy Wall Street is one answer. I mean, frankly, one of the things that is most heartening about the downturn is that how many people do you all know that have been in Wall Street for a long time that are saying, gosh, maybe I need to really change what I'm doing with my life? And in major corporations, I mean, 10% unemployment in this country will make a U.S. government gig start looking like a good job. Now, part of my concern, I think Obama's made a few big mistakes since he's come in. He made one tactical one in trying to get out in front of the outrage on the AIG bonus issue. Don't let the Congress give people bread and circuses. Obama shouldn't be doing that, right, because it's dangerous. But the single biggest mistake that he made, in my view, was after Daschle got the axe, he decided to hugely up the stakes for the FBI microscope that every single political nominee was going to go through to get confirmation. And what he should have done to be presidential is say, we've got a major crisis. And so some of the things that normally might be a bit of a problem to put people in, we have to have a government now. We can't afford to wait for several months. And you know what? We can't afford for all these good people to take themselves out of the process. And by the way, just because you used to work for a bank doesn't mean that you are not able or not qualified to work for the Treasury Department. That makes sense, doesn't it? But they didn't do that. In an abundance of caution, they decided that they were going to ensure they didn't have any more scandals, and so you go 2-3 months through and you still have no political appointees for key ambassadorships. I know Joe Nye was just through here before saying 50-50, he gets Japan. We need that ambassadorship. We need a China ambassadorship, a Saudi ambassadorship. We need people in the EPA. We need people in the Treasury Department. The world economy is moving a lot faster, and yet elections in the U.S. take just as long, and it takes longer to get people actually nominated. That's a problem, and that's an inefficiency of the politics.
Let me just footnote that, because you hit the high points, but those of us who follow this closely and go down to Washington from time to time, Treasury is the most dire situation. Empty desk after empty desk going down hallways, but it's not the only one. Almost all the major bureaucracies at the moment are vastly understaffed. And they're not going to be staffed up fast at the rate they're going. Then you get to ambassadorships, as you say. Joe Nye, 3 months ago, was told that he was going to be the choice. And he has no idea. He thinks now the best chance of finding out whether he's going to be the ambassador or not won't come until the end of the summer. Now, here we are in a situation, that's the world's #2 economy right behind us. We're in the middle of an economic crisis, and we don't have an ambassador. It makes no sense. And I've gone through this process, you have too, I know, Ian, with friends who are going into the government, and what they are going through, just in terms of documentation and interviews and whatnot else, is beyond the pale. We've really got to thing going that says nobody should be running this government unless they're a certified, patented angel. And there are not enough of them to run this government. Felix, what's your thoughts?
Oh, I just, who was that actor that was talking about a lady out there saying, I knew her before she was a virgin? and that's the way I feel about this. I've gone through the confirmation process.
I remember what you did, and you were...
It's agony. And they were in a hurry to get me there because Mrs. Harriman had died.
Yeah.
If she hadn't died, I guess she'd still be there.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Excuse me. Right there. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Rick Weaver. The term leverage and over-leveraged has been used a couple of times this evening. To what extent, if any, should Americans be concerned as public finances expand? It takes a lot of money to have state capitalism, and the budget deficits are expected to expand dramatically over the next couple of years. The question is as follows. As expansion and leverage increases for public sector finances, to what extent, if any, should we be concerned as that crowds out some of the innovative financing, technology, venture financing, as it relates to the United States that has made it what it is over the last couple of decades, and that is technology and, just the industries that have been very dynamic. Any concerns in that regard? Thank you.
Good question.
Well, I would say the concern is too much inventiveness. I mean, over the last 10, 15 years, we've invented things in the financial area that made everybody's head spin, and that was only half of it.
Yeah.
So I think we have to go back to fundamentals. I mean, certainly leverage is not in and of itself something that should be shut down, but 30 or 40 to 1 leverage is something that ought to be avoided, and some of these other things that have been created have to be regulated. You have one of the big issues coming up is how much more regulation is going to be applied to the American economy and to the banking system, because what happened is totally outrageous.
While we're on that subject, regulation is primarily national, but we're now in a globalized economy. And a lot of people are saying part of the problem is we don't have a system for globalized regulations.
That's right.
Ian, have you got any thoughts on that? Should we? Is this a pipe dream? Is it a misallocation of responsibility, or what?
Well, you'd like to see certainly more global coordination. You'd like to see the IMF function more effectively. You'd like to see strong agreements on things like tax havens and regulations around that. You'd like to see cooperation and leadership on a whole bunch of issues, public goods that aren't getting provided. And by the way, this isn't just on the economic side. This is climate change.
Sure.
This is non-proliferation on the nuclear side. This is collective security in Afghanistan and Iraq. But we are not moving into an environment where we're seeing more effective leadership. We're moving into an environment where, first of all, everyone is focused more on their domestic agendas because of the scale and scope of the crisis. And second of all, as the United States becomes increasingly both incapable and unwilling to provide that leadership by itself, no matter how much rock star status Obama has internationally, other states are not going to pony up. I was in London for the G20, meeting with some of the delegations on the side. Everyone referred to the U.S. and China as the G2. Where is that G2? What exactly are they doing? Where is the security and climate change and economic cooperation?
Well, as you know, China does not want a G2.
And I don't blame them, but I don't think anybody else does either. I told Japan, you guys would be a G1 and an eighth, I mean, they took the G20 and they said it was G2. It's really the GZ, the G nothing. And I think that, frankly, is going to continue to be where we are until there are shocks that are sufficiently seismic that require people to respond to create some of these public goods. But the level of those shocks we have not hit yet.
But Felix, your thoughts on where we're headed in regulation? Are we going to over-regulate it? Is it going to stay sort of national, or is there going to be much more global coordination this time around?
Well, I think there has to be a global coordination because of the technology that's come into this business, right. And that's like saying, we have to have plugs that plug on the floor when you're trying to get electricity. So I think there has to be some global coordination. It should go as far as possible, and I don't know, and it may not be global. It may be countries having separate agreements. But the necessity for that is absolute. We can't go on with this, with these things, and we have to regulate them. We have to really be tough on this because it's our fortune that is being dissipated here.
Yes, sir, right here.
Nice. Yes, I'm going to use my pen name and plug my book. No, author F. Temple. My question is, there's a lot of rhetoric coming from U.S. Congress and the Senate, also from France and from Russia, in regards to protectionism in trade. What kind of impact do you think that will have if we go down that route? I mean, we're talking about it. We haven't actually done anything so far. We did drop out of a few agreements, I think, recently as far as trade. What do you think that's going to do specifically for America and affect us?
Well, I guess I would say I have a fairly optimistic perspective on this. I don't think we're going to see strong protectionism come out of this country or this administration. I did mention at the beginning that the average American is more in favor of it than they used to be, but the average businessman is not. And let's face it, that's where the money is for elections. That's where the strong captured interests are. You go to the Chamber of Commerce, these guys know where their bread's buttered. They need to have more access to international markets. They're fostering that. And I think the Obama administration, you saw with the successful attempt to water down the Buy American provision, initial TARP package. They're still talking about wanting to push ahead on individual bilateral trade agreements like Panama. I've seen some talk on Georgia recently saying maybe we don't want Georgia in NATO. Maybe we should really talk about getting a good free trade agreement going with them that's more comprehensive. I think that you see all of the desire to support the automotive industry in the United States, but nobody's talking about slapping tariffs on Toyotas, right? Now, having said that, a few $1 billion in subsidy can create differences in your playing field that many other countries will say is protectionism. They will in turn use to justify their own behaviors. I'm also concerned about CFIUS. You know, when you create a Department of Homeland Security, you create an institution and a bureaucracy that is incented not to pay attention to profitability and efficiency. They're incented to find problems and slow investment, right? And they have an increasingly significant role in actually potentially obstructing foreign investment into the United States. I think they need to limit that. They need to take a very, very tight look at what is really a security problem and what isn't. I think those issues will become larger over time, but I don't think it's a short-term sort of nuclear protectionism that we're really worried about.
A lot of people have made the following comment after the G20, which is that 17 of the countries that went there and who said, no, we don't want any protection, had already put through some protectionist measures. But the general consensus I've heard from economists, like Ian, I'm not one of them, is that the level of protectionism so far is really not very much. And the question is, will it mushroom if this economic crisis goes on too long or continues to dip down? What's your feeling, Felix?
I think it will.
Yeah.
I think it will. And it may not start here, but if it may start in Europe. It may start somewhere else. It may start when the Chinese start dumping $2,500 cars that go 87 miles to the gallon, right, and put up their dealers here.
Right.
You know? So I think it's hard to think that with technology being what it is and people being very needy, that they will not succumb to the benefit that they can get quickly.
Yeah. Yes, sir, right there. Down here.
Thank you. I'm John Royal. During the Cold War, we had an arms race with the Soviet Union, and our government backed the military establishment in that effort. Until recently, we've had a serious quest by the Chinese for raw materials in other countries, particularly Africa, and particularly energy products. When this resumes again, will our government do for our industries what the Chinese government has done for their industries in terms of pursuing these opportunities abroad, both in terms of financing at practically non-existent interest rates, and also in terms of supporting corruption and bribery?
Well, they might. They might. Certainly on the first front. Hopefully not in the second, but maybe there too. I take your point, and I think about one of the big strategic issues of investment that the U.S. was trying to really foster at the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the post-Cold War order, which was the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline. And America said they really wanted, happiness was multiple pipelines. You may remember the bumper stickers that the congressman used to be circulating around in Washington. And you had companies like BP and ExxonMobil and the rest saying, well, that's great, but how about helping us build it? Because the oil price of oil is too low and we're not going to do it. And you said, well, we want you to do it, but we're not going to help you. And the Chinese, of course, and many others are going around, and they're not looking at this from a market pricing perspective. They're looking at this from a much more strategic commodities buy-up perspective. And I don't think it's actually slowed down all that much. I mean, just last week, the Chinese became the largest investors in the world and trade partners in Brazil, taking over from the United States, and we'll see more of that. A couple things I'd say about this. First is that the Chinese will get their fingers burned in serious ways because they're learning this for the first time. One of the ways we'll know that China is becoming a very serious player globally is when their embassies start getting bombed by terrorists in these countries. Right? Because they are going to become the new 800-pound gorilla, and it will be a problem. The second point is that the Americans have an enormous military advantage over the Chinese, and hard power does matter in this environment, not because you're going to see a war, but because the Chinese don't have a blue water navy, and they're building one, but it's very slow. It's not the next 10 years. It's probably not really the next 20.
It took us about 100 years to get a full-fledged blue navie. That's a very expensive and complicated process,
and we're keeping it. Yeah. And you saw what happened with piracy. Yeah. I mean, the Americans said, "You want to help us, China?" And they send over a frigate, and they go, "Wow, these guys are pretty good." They're going to increasingly need the United States to help have access to some of these resources, and that provides a little bit of leverage. But I certainly agree with Felix that if we get to an environment over the long term where the Chinese are actually seen as a threat for scarce resources or for scarce jobs or for scarce technology, then you'll see more protectionism. I'm more worried on the commodities front about China-Japan relations in the near-medium term than I am on the U.S. side, especially because after you get a couple drinks and members of the Keidanren in Tokyo, they fundamentally loathe and mistrust the Chinese, and it's mutual.
It is mutual.
Yeah.
We have time, I think, for about one more question before I take it. I hope you all can come to the reception we have after this up in the Rockefeller Room on the second floor. No, where is it being held? All right, we're right across the way. Also, on your way out, we have the books by Felix and Ian on sale here. I've read them both. I can tell you they're really wonderful books, and you'll learn quite a bit. Now, last question, back there.
Gregory Mark Hill. Can you share some examples of how China is using its sovereign wealth funds to increase its political advantage in the global theater?
I guess the first thing I would say about that is actually harking back to the last question, which is really on the commodity side. It's going in and taking significant positions, equity positions, in actually buying up in frontier markets in Africa, in Latin America, in Australia, pieces of companies at rates that would be considered beyond market, driving those prices up, which long term will provide regular access to those markets. They're also developing strategic reserves of something like 186 different commodities. Hard reserves. I didn't know there were 186 different commodities, but apparently they're driving them. I also would say that the answer to your question is we don't know, because there's not an awful lot of transparency on exactly what these sovereign wealth funds are doing in a lot of these environments, and there won't be. And the ability of the United States and the G7 to enforce, we'd love to see regulatory policy that I think enforces standards of transparency on these organizations, but you have to have agreement. The G20 is the new format for that. It's very difficult for me to see that actually happening in the near term.
We hear a lot about the Chinese purchases around the world on energy and other critical subjects. And part of the reason is because they're the new kid on the block and they're paying such terrific prices. But what the Chinese find when they go in an awful lot of places is that we were there first, and they've been there for a long time. We have an array of international obligations, if you will, that the Chinese have yet to match. But Felix, let's close with your thoughts on the Chinese program. Are they overpaying? Is this necessary? Is this something we should be worried about? Or is what should be expected from a rising power?
Well, you know, that's a very broad and difficult question to answer. I think the Chinese are doing exactly what they think they ought to be doing and what their people tell them they ought to be doing. There's probably a lot of discontent because poverty is much more broadly there than it should be. But they will find their way because they will put the money there. And they seem to be rather efficient at investing, whether it's the public sector. I read the other day they're building 100 airports, rural
Right.
small airports, and building I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of kilometers of road and how many high-speed trains. So they will do that, and as a result of doing that, they will have advantages that they will be creating for themselves in relationship to countries that aren't doing it now. We're not doing it even though we are rich enough to do it, because we'd rather spend it, I don't know where, but certainly not building high-speed trains. And that will cost us. That will cost us. And in addition to which, they're putting, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of children through school every year. They all have to speak English in certain grades. We're nowhere near that kind of investment in people's brains. And so we're just letting go of things that are of incredible value, namely the intelligence and the capability of our people. Sorry.
Help me. Well, help me thank these two great panelists. I think it was a very informative evening. Thank you.